You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. All right, welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your lost host, Abraham.
And I am your found host, Shane. Which I feel is appropriate since I came on later in the show history.
Oh, yeah. Good point. And I lost my way since we started. We are a psychology podcast. We tackle all psychology things. And this is actually a listener request episode.
Yeah, we had somebody write in and was kind of talking about this idea of like why people do this and how it can be dangerous for folks to just join in. And we're going to talk about all that today. But thank you for writing in and asking us to do this because this was a lot of fun to put together. It's really interesting and valuable stuff here.
Which really, I think, emphasizes the point that if you have a really good idea, then feel free to email us or reach out to us on social media, and we are happy to take those into consideration. We don't take every idea that comes through our doors, but if you got like a really good, solid one like this, awesome.
Yeah.
We're going to jump all over it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Now, if you haven't already, you should subscribe to our podcast wherever you are listening to your podcast to ensure that you get every new episode into your feed. This is good for you. It's good for us. It's good for the world. So you can do that. Also, share us with a friend, rate and review, or at least rate. And if you'd like to support us financially, you get some extra bonus goodies. You get videos of us recording so you can see what we look like. Me in the morning, Shane in the afternoon, because we record from different time zones. You get a lot of behind the scenes extra content of us talking about music and movies and art and all kinds of weird stuff. And it's unedited, unscripted, unfiltered, purely us.
Yeah, Justin doesn't touch it. It's so much fun.
That's right.
And I think, too, like, we've got some really cool goodies coming up for our patrons as well, including some new merch stuff that we're designing and some fun discounts on that. So be on the lookout because in our patrons, we'll get first dibs on all that stuff.
Absolutely. All right. And so what are we talking about today, Shane?
Today, we are talking about search and rescue. So one thing, this kind of came up because somebody had written it in, and when we had started doing some research on it, there's that story that came up about the missing man that ended up joining his own search party. And this is so great. So basically, a search party is organized because this guy is missing, and they are doing a particular type of search. They are searching the woods for this guy. They can't find him. And this guy just kind of tags along and he's like, hey, what's everybody doing here? I guess we'll look for this guy too. And it ended up being his own search party. Like they were looking for him. And we're going to talk about this later. This is called a bastard search, which is my favorite term that I learned about this. And there's a specific reason why, as I imagine that all of our intelligent listeners can glean why it's called a bastard search. But we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So what we're going to try to answer today is, what is search and rescue? Why do people do it? What does it take to be involved in search and rescue? And specifically some really important search and rescue events that have happened in human history.
All right, so let's get into a little bit of the background here. Search and rescue, often also abbreviated as SAR or SARS. Not really SARS, but just SAR.
Singular SAR.
Singular, just one by itself. Is the process by which people in some type of imminent danger or distress are found and then subsequently provided with aid. And this includes two primary components, which are kind of given away in the title: search and rescue.
Yeah. So search is going to be the part where the team is notified of a person in distress. The team then organizes. They might involve some other experts and all that to find the person at a reported designation or destination or wherever they are. So wherever they are, they will find that person. And the type of organization and team may be determined by the location of the person in distress, what type of distress they're in, what type of equipment is required. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but the search part is identifying that a person is in distress and seeking them out.
So that's half of the title. The second half is rescue, in which the team aiding the person provides whatever immediate aid may be necessary, and also probably likely helps to remove the person from the area in which they were found. And this may lead to further aid at some other facility following the extraction, I guess, from their site at which they were located.
Now, one of the first well-documented cases of search and rescue efforts took place in 1656. So this is not a new concept by any means, but when we kind of get into the modern version of it and the organization, you'll see kind of how it developed. Now, this first documented case came with the Virgide Drake, and it's a merchant ship that had actually wrecked off the coast of Australia. As a quick side note, I'm going to provide an in-episode recommendation. You should go read In a Sunburned Country by Bill Bryson. Australia is an incredibly fascinating place that does not get nearly the credit it deserves, and he does a really great job of diving into the history of this place, and it makes sense why there were so many shipwrecks off the coast of Australia for any number of reasons.
I think you've mentioned that one before on previous episodes, so
yes.
That definitely should be. And also just note, Bill Bryson, very awesome, a well-respected author, good writer, so...
Yeah, absolutely.
We're talking about people who are looking for this merchant ship. And so, spoiler alert, despite sending 3 teams out for missions to find the ship, they were unsuccessful. It is probably on the bottom of the ocean somewhere.
Now, this is important to remember, is that search and rescue is not always successful. And that's going to lead to some of the psychology and the mental health stuff that we're going to talk about later. Now, in the United States, the Revenue Cutter Service was often utilized to help assist mariners at sea. And this began in 1790.
Wow.
But 1790, when you think about it, it's like, that was a long time ago, but also not very long ago when it comes to like finding and rescuing people. Like when you think about like the fact that this was like a fairly new idea in human history is kind of interesting to me.
Well, first, early documented, there may have been things that were like it that were just not formal or structured or documented.
Or somebody was like, the gods willed it goodbye. It's kind of like this,
That's right.
So there's any number of reasons why, who knows. But the Revenue Cutter Service, it began working and utilizing their services in 1790, but officially formalized in 1837, where the organization was sanctioned and provided additional government assistance to support missions. So they were given additional resources in 1837 to start doing more search and rescue events.
So the sanction eventually led to the formal establishment of the United States Life Saving Service, or USLSS, rolls right off the tongue.
It's totally.
Which formed about 50 years later in 1878, and this is where additional services were provided.
Now, in 1915, the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service and the USLSS, or the United States Life Saving Service, were formally combined to create the U.S. Coast Guard, which is still an active branch of the military in the United States. So a lot, like some of the first search and rescue efforts and organizations actually led to the creation of the United States Coast Guard.
Awesome. The organization and implementation of formal search and rescue processes began in New Zealand in 1933. Prior to this, many of the missions that existed were just volunteer groups, and not to say just to trivialize it, but it just wasn't an organized or coordinated effort through a regulatory body. Mm-hmm. But these volunteer groups commissioned to engage in search and rescue missions.
Yeah, and so for trampers, which in New Zealand is a person who walks long distances in rough country or terrain for fun, they were lost in the Tararua Ranges. I had a hard time pronouncing that as I was reading it, and I had to look up enunciations, and my best guess is Tararua.
That makes sense. That's how it looks to me as well.
It feels like that. This range runs about 50 miles on the North Island of New Zealand, and most of the range is covered in protected wilderness as part of the Tararua Forest. And this range included Pukemoamo. I feel like that felt really good.
Yeah, actually, that was very solid. That I was like looking at it like, how is this going to go? And I felt like you nailed it.
Thank you so much. Now, that peak reaches 5,150 feet, and Mount Hector, or its Maori name is Pukamumu, or its nickname Hill of Desolation, is part of this range. So there's some
lovely,
dangerous terrain in this area.
Kia koto to our New Zealand friends, I think is how you say that. All right, so 20 teams were utilized in the search, and that include tramping clubs, deer stalkers, radio teams, and various search committees. Deer stalkers is a funny name.
So good.
Yeah, because this isn't even hunter. I assume that they're hunters, but it doesn't, because it doesn't have the word hunter. I imagine these people who are just like following deer around.
Yeah.
Like spying on them and keeping a journal.
I see you.
That's right. 10 a.m. Deer pooped. So they found the trampers, and when they did, one of the people that they found was quoted as saying, "We were never lost. We had an altimeter, a barometer, 3 compasses, and a map. We knew our position within a mile at all times."
So that had to have been kind of frustrating.
Yeah.
That goes back into the bastard search later, too. So that's kind of a fun thing. Now, In 1935, the Tararua Tramping Club formally proposed that local police should engage in coordinated efforts along with the Federated Mountain Clubs to organize these different searches, these search parties that would go out. This was decided due to the amount of resources that were readily available within the law enforcement organizations like training teams, communication systems, and mobile units, as well as the overarching organization of those particular communities.
Great. So today, there are over 90 countries that coordinate to engage in search and rescue missions. The International Search and Rescue Advisory Group, which again has the very catchy title of INSARAG, or INSARAG, includes a global network. As I said, it was over 90 countries, and that they coordinate various search and rescue missions around the world, which is fantastic because a lot of people, they're going to be not necessarily within their own borders when they maybe go missing. And so having an international group committed to just saving people is a really cool thing.
Yeah.
This group operates under the United Nations and coordinates efforts to improve urban search and rescue missions for natural disasters. And we'll talk more about the urban search and rescue because you might not think about the fact that people also get lost in cities.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the process for search and rescue, let's go ahead and take a quick ad break and we'll be back in a second. And we're back. So let's talk a little bit about how these organizations get together and where a specific search and rescue event might start.
So what happens when a search and rescue is needed? There are various reasons why a mission might be necessary, and this may include that someone is injured or missing, there are natural disasters, terrorist attacks, or accidents, as well as other reasons worth any other event that may have occurred. But the point is that there are human people who are presumed to be alive who need help.
Yeah, and so in each of these circumstances, specialized teams are mobilized and organized, and they get enlisted to help with parts of the SAR missions, and there are 4 main components. So even though we talked earlier about how there's 2 particular sections, search and rescue, there are actually 4 main components to any search and rescue mission that require specialized teams in each phase.
Yeah, so we've got search, rescue, technical, and medical, and so let's go over each one.
Yeah, so search is going to be, as we previously mentioned, these are the groups that specialize in finding victims and finding people who are lost or injured. And they can employ a lot of different methods. They may use unique technology to find victims in their search, and there are different strategies that they use as well. So for instance, some teams employ drones, and where they use like drones with like heat-sensitive cameras that can see people within dense forest or something like that. Others might use techniques like the grid search or choke point searches. To illustrate that, a grid search is usually used as a last resort. And that's usually what you'll see in like different depictions of search and rescue on TV, where they'll have a lot of people in a line and they'll kind of scan and sweep over large areas. They'll take over like a small little component of a section to kind of look at. Now, what's really interesting about this is that it is a last resort because it requires so many people moving together slowly through an area that could be dangerous for those people to be involved in.
You know, it also occurs to me that I imagine that they use somewhat similar techniques, at least for the search part, as when they're doing a manhunt. Where they will not get to the second part of this, which is rescue. They're just going to get the search and then detain, I guess.
Yeah. That's a whole different thing.
Interesting topic. I wonder if it'd be worth talking about manhunts at some point.
Yeah, we're adding it to the list.
Yeah, particularly given that there was a fairly large one recently in the United States at the time of this recording. We did a related episode on bounty hunters.
Yes, we did.
All right, so the second stage, that if you're not being hunted because you did something illegal or escaped from jail, but instead you're in trouble, is the rescue stage. And at this point, this includes extracting or removing a person from an area. This can be tricky. It may include specialized equipment to make airlifts, medical transportation devices, etc. You just got to be prepared for whatever might be the case to help extract someone who might not be in a place that's easy to extract. There was a story of someone who went spelunking, more or less, in a cave where they ended up being trapped vertically in a very small portion of the cave. They like sucked in air to like get through it. They got stuck and then couldn't get out again. And being upside down, the blood like pooling in their brain was actually starting to cause some problems. I think they had to chisel them out of the rock, but that means they're going to need that specific equipment, is like you need a jackhammer or some kind of rock chiseling equipment or whatever to help get them out of wherever they might be stuck.
You know, I don't think that I'm claustrophobic by any means. Like, I don't ever have that feeling of being like stressed out about small spaces and all that. But that is so upsetting right now. Like thinking about being stuck upside down because I couldn't take a deep enough breath. Oh,
yeah.
I hate that.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. It's super rough.
So sorry we should probably put a spoiler alert or like a kind of a trigger warning for our claustrophobic folks because oh God. Okay, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
All right. There's also the technical team. Okay. And the technical team actually works to monitor and evaluate the safety of the rescuer. So you'll have a team that kind of hangs back, that monitors to make sure that everybody is communicating. They're going to include these stationary teams that manage the communication pieces, that monitor the systems for specific areas, that monitor changes in weather and all that stuff and help communicate new information down to the rescue teams.
And a final step for this is a medical team will be deployed to ensure there is medical assistance to address any injuries, to inform extraction practices as needed, to ensure that we don't kill the person while trying to get them out of the situation that they're in or cause any serious harm, really. But also, like, they're probably going to be in some sort of need. At the very least, they're likely to be dehydrated, but they also might have other injuries that need attending to. Otherwise, they might not be lost. Like, a lot of times...
Like those trampers.
Yeah. A lot of times, this isn't the case that someone's actually injured, but a lot of times the reason that they're lost is because they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about what it takes to work in this space, because that was actually kind of the premise for the show. What are the requirements to work in search and rescue? And the first one is that in order to join any sort of search and rescue team, members that are qualified to do this and do this well have to have quite a few skills that are both general to overall SAR practices and processes and specific to the terrain and type of SAR that's being conducted. So folks that are joining search and rescue teams have to have some general safety skills, and we'll talk about some of those, but also you should have some knowledge about where you're going.
I feel like we should intro the section with, so you've decided to join a search and rescue.
So you decided to save some lives.
That's right. Do you know if they always pronounce it SAR or if it's SAR?
I don't know. I didn't see anything on that.
Okay. I'm going to assume SAR, but if we said it wrong, then write in and let us know.
Yeah.
All right. So if you are seeking employment in the SAR or the SAR, the search and rescue industry, you may need to obtain emergency responder qualifications for whichever team you plan to join. And to get this credential, you'll need a high school diploma or equivalent, so GED, or higher, obviously, completion of a training program. And sometimes this can be up to 2 years, so it is a time commitment, and gain a certification or license depending on the state in which you're getting qualified for this.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about that. Like, this is specific to employment with either state agencies or with private agencies that work in this type of space. This is for specifically employment, not necessarily volunteer work. And we'll talk about volunteer work in a little bit.
So this might not necessarily pertain to people who are joining the international search and rescue.
There might be some different requirements that go along with international, and usually the international organization is that network of people. So like it's the countries, like the international one is the countries that are like linked to that network, but the individual countries will have their own requirements.
Got it.
Now, beyond the requirements above that we talked about for general SAR employment, those who are interested in working in the field may obtain additional credentials and certifications to work on more specialized teams. So, for example, if you want to work on a medical team, there might be some additional training in emergency medicine, while those who are working on search teams, specifically working to go and find the folks, you might need survival training based on the terrain that is being searched or that you're working in. So there's a lot of different things that might come out of this that are more specialized depending on the teams and terrain you're working in.
And I didn't know this, but you can actually get certified in wilderness first aid to become a wilderness first aid responder, which I think that's really neat.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, I mean, I don't want to do that here because I feel like that's just like the training here is just basically wrestling an alligator.
Yeah.
Or learning how to like lasso and ride a shark.
Yeah. Or maybe like prying open a python's jaws.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. Or
yeah. Or like how to scare a black bear, which is just stand up tall and scream at it.
Yeah. Or, you know, wearing a mask in public in Florida.
Dude, there's no way that's happening here. You know how dangerous that is?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I imagine for the wilderness first aid, there's a lot of like how to manage bear attack bites, sort of Revenant style,
and maybe like how to live off the land, like how to like there's all kinds of stuff, like how to transport somebody on rocky terrain, how to like maybe climb and stuff like that. And actually, let's talk about that. So it's also recommended that if you're working on a SAR team, like we just mentioned, or you're kind of getting into wilderness first aid, you might want to hone in on a few other skills. You might want to know navigation. You might want to know how to like read a compass or read a map if you have one, or
read the stars.
Radio communication, because there are very specific skills that go along with radio communication that you have to know and kind of learn.
Some wilderness survival training and also first aid, as we sort of talked about, as well as rope and climbing, because there's going to be a lot of situations in which you might need to go up or go down and come back up, and you'll need those skills handy.
And that's going to involve knots and loops and all kinds of things. It is stressful to think about how many knots that I don't know.
Not knots.
Not knots. No. You're also going to need leadership and teamwork skills, because you're going to have to work with a large coordinated team. You're probably going to need some experience with trekking and hiking, and you're probably going to need some swimming and water safety skills.
Or tramping
if you're in New Zealand. Or you're going to need swimming and water safety, because there are situations where somebody might be stranded on an island or in the middle of a lake, or there might be some small bodies of water that you have to get through to get to the person. So there's some other things that you're going to need too.
Or in the middle of a swamp.
Or in the middle of a swamp, as is Florida.
Throwing Florida under the bus as often as I possibly can.
If you're in Florida, if you're on a SAR team, you're going to need to know how to operate an airboat.
Yeah.
You're going to need to know how to learn to ride the winds of a hurricane. Look, there's all kinds of stuff that you could do here.
You need to survive the current governor.
Yeah.
Whoever it might be,
because it's always a thing.
Yeah, it's never good. Let's talk about types of search and rescue. And we sort of mentioned, because there are these ones you might not think of. We've been talking about generalized search and rescue procedures up to this point, and it's worth discussing that there might be different types of search and rescue teams that exist in the sort of world of SAR. And this might be due to the type of emergency or terrain that you'll need to operate in.
If you've watched TV or movies and you've seen a lot of the different types of SAR activities that go on, they're usually wilderness, mountains, or water rescues. And that's what you see a lot of. And actually, you'll see that portrayed on TV a lot, too. When they show search teams, they're usually searching through like a different type of forest, or they're looking at mountain ranges. You'll see airlifts out of water rescues from capsized boats and whatnot. But there are a lot of different types of SAR rescues that we're going to talk about. First one is mountain rescue. Mountain rescue is going to be when SAR teams require wilderness training, as well as experience to climb, to use ropes, to look at rocky terrains, to learn how to search mountain ranges. And we're going to talk about cave rescues, but a lot of times mountain rescue teams will also have cave rescue experience as well. You also have ground rescue, which is very similar to that, except that the terrain is a little bit more flat. You're going to look at large areas of search and rescue versus like the mountain ranges, which might be a little bit more specific. There's things that go along with like looking at flat ground forests and stuff. Like Florida has a lot of forests, but there's no mountains here. So that's a lot of where ground SAR might occur.
Or hills or bumps.
Yeah, there's very few bumps here.
In a few years, there'll be very little land also.
Yeah, give it some time.
Then there's also the urban SAR, and mostly where you're going to see this happening is when there are natural disasters. So this is hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, other major catastrophic events that happen in an urban setting. That includes things like collapsed buildings, plane crashes, hazardous material spills, that sort of things. So you might not have actually thought like that search and rescue is going to be a thing, and urban search and rescue certainly sounds like it'd be relevant when you lose your kid inevitably at Disney World. But otherwise, it's mostly talking about these sort of disasters that occur in a city.
And we've got some specific examples of that to cover too. You've also got combat SAR, which is primarily focused on military or combat zone rescues, where it's like you have to have highly specialized people with specialized military training, safety training, and there's a lot of dangers that go along with that, obviously, if you're in a combat zone. And this puts the rescue workers at a very high risk, usually a higher risk than these other terrains, simply because of the nature of the violence that goes on in these spaces. And specifically, a lot of times these SAR teams will have to go behind enemy lines to be able to rescue people. Like there might be a downed plane, or maybe a battalion has been lost behind the enemy lines and they need to kind of bring them back. And so a lot of the folks that work in combat and military have training to survive these spaces, but the combat SAR folks are just a whole nother breed of people.
SAR, yes, SAR.
That was smooth. That was good.
Thank you. There's also maritime rescue. This is more or less what it sounds like. This focuses on water rescues when and where necessary. This may be ships run aground, or ships that have sunk, or survivors either stranded on a boat or at sea. There was a story that was probably at least 10 years old now of a ship that went down, and there was somebody, or maybe a couple of somebodies, that were trapped in an air pocket in the ship, and all they had to survive on for several days was like Pepsi or some like soda or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that would be a maritime rescue example.
Yeah, and there's also cave rescues, kind of like what Abraham just brought up with the person spelunking and being trapped and all that. And cave rescues include careful navigation of cave systems because something that you learn about caves, we don't have them all mapped out, and they are all very dangerous. Do yourself a favor, if you want to like really scare yourself, either watch The Descent or read The Outsider by Stephen King, because there's a whole scene with a bunch of caves that are really horrifying. So
really good adaptation. That was like a little miniseries, I think.
Yeah, they did a really good job of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So cave rescues, a lot of times those folks that work in that navigation, they have to know cave systems. They have to know cave mapping, climbing, rope work, evacuation based on cave systems. They need to know cave safety because sometimes caves are unstable, caverns are unstable. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that too that's very specialized. And the fact that I know that much about cave systems and I live in Florida where there are no caves is kind of, I think, it's pretty impressive. So you're welcome for that.
Yeah, I mean, they can fill with water. They can have all kinds of animals in them. There's dangerous gases. Caves are amazing and beautiful, and they can be very dangerous. So got to be careful in there.
Absolutely.
Next, let's talk about why the conditions under which search and rescue is going to be necessary. But first, let's take a quick ad break. Okay, so we broke and we are broken, and now we're back from being broken. We're going to put ourselves back together and talk about why search and rescue is necessary. I always felt like it was weird to call it an ad break. I mean, I guess you're breaking up the flow of content, but it sounds like you're taking a break, and I'm like, it's not, though, because now I have to listen to ads. So
yeah, and it's also, too, for those folks that are listening, we don't actually take a break. No. Like, we just pause for a second, and then we just keep going.
Like, literally 1 or 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So no breaks for anybody. It's lose-lose.
It's lose-lose.
I take a necessary ad obligation. That's what we should call it.
Yeah, that's what we should call it from now on. Yeah.
All right, most people are not trained or equipped to thrive in nature outside of the comforts of a sort of modern living situation. I mean, I'm sure some people get there and they could get there, but we've really softened our evolutionary development due to the modern conveniences that we have afforded ourselves over time. Let's face it. Mm-hmm. If you're busy listening to this podcast, you're probably not Bear Grylls.
But if anybody knows Bear Grylls and we can interview him, that would be awesome too. So go ahead and put in a good word for us.
Bear Grylls, welcome on the podcast anytime.
We have so many questions about drinking pee. I mean, we could probably get that information from other groups too. So I guess that's maybe not, he's not the expert. He's not the monolith on pee drinking. So
I'm pretty sure that somebody, I'm not even joking. I'm pretty sure that someone is touting that as a COVID cure right now.
They're probably from Florida.
It is, in fact, Ron DeSantis.
It is Ron DeSantis. That sounds like something he would say. Why is search and rescue necessary? Why are we even talking about this? Well, here's some basic stats on this. Now, between 2004 and 2014, 46,609 people required some type of search and rescue aid in U.S. national parks alone.
That is so many.
That is so many people in just parks. And it makes sense, like you mentioned before. A lot of people just get lost because they don't know how to navigate. They get lost in the wilderness. They kind of lose track of their paths, and they require somebody.
Weirdly, that is almost exactly the number of acres that burned in the Arizona fire from the gender reveal party from the episode that we just did last week.
Yeah, it's a person per acre.
A person per acre, almost.
So wild. Now, 1,578 people died in these instances, with 13,957 of these folks either being injured or falling ill as a result of being lost. Now, this doesn't include other types of SAR missions, and that's really important to remember, is that this is just U.S. national parks by themselves.
Is there a sort of sex or gender component to people who are needing SAR rescuing? Kind of. 53% of people needing SAR missions are men, but that's not, I mean, that's pretty close to half. So it's a pretty relatively healthy mix. Of the recorded SAR missions, 17% of people needing help are between the ages of 20 and 29, making up the largest age demographic, which makes a lot of sense. It's your knees still work. You still have the motivation to get out the front door.
Yeah, you don't need a walking stick.
Exactly. Past that, you're just in a wheelchair. So
yeah,
which
exactly. This is us. Yeah, my hips hurt. Now, most SAR missions are run as mountain rescues between 5,000 and 15,000 foot elevations. That's the highest number of SAR missions that occurred in that period of time. Now, swamps included 1% of all SAR missions between 2004 and 2014, because more than likely, if somebody is lost in a swamp, they will never be found.
Yeah, I was just going to make a joke. Like, there's no finding from that one. That's a one and done sort of thing.
For those of you who are not familiar with swamps and bogs, they are muddy holes full of water, and everything wants you dead, whether it's a python or an alligator or something like that. in the Everglades are this expansive swamp that people get lost in all the time.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
It is teeming with life, teeming with like predatory life and bacteria and diseases, and it's hot and sweaty.
Even the grass wants you dead. The grass is sharp. It hurts.
Yeah.
Like it's called sawgrass because it cuts you up. It's horrible.
Yeah, the plants there are trying to kill you. The water's trying to kill you. Everything's trying to kill you. If you get lost in the swamps.
If it's not a 14-foot alligator, it's an amoeba. It's a brain-eating amoeba.
Exactly. 42% of SAR cases were victims engaging in daytime hiking. So that makes up a pretty large chunk of those.
Yeah.
It does seem like mountain rescue is probably fairly high on here.
Yeah. And most people needing rescue needed help due to fatigue or diminished physical conditions. That was about 22.8% of the rescues. Now, the second most needed reason for rescues is that people exhibited poor judgment. They just didn't know better. And that's 18.8%.
Milk was a bad choice.
Milk was a bad choice. My favorite stat on this was that 0.3% of SAR cases were due to horseplay.
Oh, no.
People were just messing around. They messed around and they found out that they were lost is what happened.
Yeah, the business end of the horseplay consequence.
That's why you see signs at pools. There's no horseplay. Could you imagine that? Like, I'm at a pool, I engage in horseplay, and now I need search and rescue because I'm lost in the forest. That's what happens. That's how you get there.
It's very discriminatory against horses. All right, 93% of victims were found within 24 hours, which is encouraging. Only 3% of those needing SAR were never found, which is not encouraging because that's still a large number.
Yeah.
And then they turn up, I think, probably sometimes when you have like a national attention to a person that you're trying to find. Maybe that person's like a young, attractive white female.
Yeah.
And then they start recovering all these other bodies.
There's a whole phenomenon that goes along with that we could probably talk about too, which just kind of, highlights the inherent systematic racism that is the United States. But we're not going to open that can of worms today either. That's a whole thing. So, according to the U.S. Coast Guard in 2017, there were 15,951 cases where SAR protocols were used. And so that's just in 2017 alone. Of those cases, 618 victims lost their lives, so 0.03% of the total reports. And of that group, only 198 were lost after the Coast Guard were notified. So that's 0.012%, meaning that of all those cases, 420 victims lost their lives before the Coast Guard even knew SAR was needed.
Oof.
What this is saying, essentially, this is making the case that SAR missions are highly successful, and usually people survive them as long as they get the report before the person dies.
Yes. And as long as it does not have anything to do with water.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
All right. So let's talk about why people get involved in search and rescue. And this actually really gets at the crux of why we started talking about this topic in the first place and why this was suggested. So there's sort of four main reasons to think about why someone might get involved in search and rescue. Some people feel like it is very rewarding for them to feel like they're being helpful, right?
Yeah.
And there's this altruistic view of search and rescue that some people gravitate toward. Essentially, if there's a problem, we tend to enjoy providing our services, our aid, our support, and helping to solve that problem. Many search and rescue programs include volunteers, so monetary rewards often an inherent part of the job. And so one thing I want to point out is that that might be part of the reason is that people like feeling helpful. These reasons could have a lot of overlap with one another.
Yeah. So the next one I would say is notoriety. And so this is probably not going to be most of the volunteers that participate in SAR missions, but
just dog the bounty hunter.
Right, just dog, right? Now, if you are the person to find the victim, then this may come with television interviews, may come with public recognition. You may be the hero of the day. So you might find kind of like a lot of attention that gets poured on you as a result of being the person that saved the day. And more daring missions can lead to sensationalist accounts of the rescue, which leads to even more headlines. So you're going to have volunteers to participate in these really dangerous and risky search and rescue events and missions so that they can be a part of something that's going to require a lot of or get a lot of attention and gain a lot of attention as a result.
You might overestimate your skills, and in some cases volunteers are really grossly overestimating their ability to help. And they may have some experience in non-SAR related fields like military backgrounds, wilderness training, etc. And there is this belief that these skills generalize directly to SAR activities, but they do lack some of the organization and coordination that goes along with the search and rescue work. And so they might be getting themselves in way over their heads, thinking, hey, we can be helpful, or hey, this is going to look really good for me. or I know what I'm doing here because I have this other related training. And it's not to say that that training wouldn't help, but I think it's just you got to be cautious about knowing what you know and what you don't know.
Right.
And assume that unless you are explicitly trained to do search and rescue, then you should probably at least be listening to the people who are in terms of what kind of assistance you can really provide.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part of this is like you might have some skills, but you don't have the other skills that usually go along with SAR teams. And I think that goes back to the fourth reason that people join is they don't know. They don't know any better. They might overestimate their skills, and they might believe that their skills might translate into SAR activities and SAR missions, but they think that sometimes it's just simply walking through the woods and calling somebody's name. When they talk about grid searches and they talk about how you walk through, like you're not supposed to walk around obstacles. You're supposed to move through them as if you were walking through the woods and got lost in them. Like, and what they'll say is a lot of times people will walk around and they'll miss people in those searches because they'll walk around an obstacle. They'll miss something that is an essential part of that terrain.
Yeah.
And so sometimes this lack of knowledge that has to do with SAR missions can really get in the way. And that lack of understanding about training, lack of understanding about equipment, lack of understanding about coordination, people will jump in and not realize that it is far more complex than they thought it was. And so they might volunteer with a healthy dose of ignorance walking in.
Now, another part of this we haven't really talked about is a lot of times search and rescue will involve animals that help with this.
Mm-hmm.
And so what will often happen sometimes too is that people will like, I have this really smart, highly trained dog, or I have free time and an animal that is good at herding, or, whatever it might be, that you have some reason to believe that you might be valuable in a search and rescue effort because you feel like you bring something important to the table, which might be your willingness to help and your highly capable pet. Well, what's important to understand about that is that, again, these are really highly specialized, dynamic, and dangerous situations. And if you are ill prepared for it, you might just slow down the team. You might put yourself and others in danger, and you might inadvertently harm the animal as well. So it's got to be one of those things where if you are interested in looking into joining one of these efforts, like that's awesome. And like, I think that they really need people like that. And ensure that you go through the kind of training and certification and processes necessary to ensure that you can be a really big contribution. Just showing up on the site with your dog and be like, hey, he's got a nose and like I got legs, like I can help, is probably going to actually be less helpful than honestly even like giving them like, here's $100 so you guys can buy the supplies you need.
Yeah.
If you want to help and you don't want to go through the training, then I would say donate to organizations that do this sort of thing,
mm-hmm.
or champion their cause by promoting it in certain areas and raising awareness. But if you want to really be involved, you really need to go through the appropriate networks and channels to get the appropriate training. Otherwise, it just creates an additionally dangerous situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one more thing I think to add to talking about why people get involved in this, because there are people who get involved in this, I think, through a couple different routes. One is that they were sort of already in things that were like medical aid, wilderness, and that sort of just transitioned gradually into getting involved with search and rescue, going through training and that sort of thing, because that they enjoyed that kind of work. And I think that there's probably a natural transition that occurs in some of those. I think there are people in relatively similar positions who do a lot of basic human service work and a lot of first aid and that sort of thing, who also maybe found themselves on that trajectory. So I think another group of people here generally is that there are people who they just like helping people.
Yeah.
They find a lot of meaning in their work when they are contributing in some way where they get to save a life or rescue someone, or even if necessary, recover a body.
Mm-hmm.
But they are drawn to the kind of work that involves this kind of process that's a lot of dynamic, it's intense, but it can be very rewarding. And so I think that might be something where they either migrate to it gradually through natural processes, or they specifically seek it out because they really enjoy doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's totally reasonable and totally fair. Speaking of all that and kind of talking about the reasons why and some of the fallouts, one of the things I found really interesting about SAR missions was kind of the outcomes, right? So we talked about the stats of like all the safety and stuff, but I always think about the people that are involved. Like I think about healthcare work and how that impacts people that work in that space. I think about police work and how that might impact the officers and all that. But I was interested about the psychology of folks that are involved in SAR missions. And so we pulled some research like we do. We like research. So
we do.
Let's go ahead and look at this a little bit. So Trainer Aguirre, I imagine how that's pronounced.
In my American eyes, it's Aguirre.
Aguirre. We gotta say it with a Florida accent. Aguirre and McNeil in 2008. They analyzed patterns in SAR research as a means to inform practices among various SAR activities. And what they found was that in the majority of SAR protocols across the world, there are embedded social practices within the roles of SAR teams. So what they find is that there are traditional divisions of labor, organization, and activities based on social norms within communities. So they'll have some folks that are designated to do certain types of work and some others that work in the communications departments and stuff like that. But despite the social norms embedded in those practices, there was still a formalized structure and continuity outlined by Quarantelli and Dines in 1977 that were present in the majority of practices. So basically what that's saying is that in every SAR protocol that they evaluated, there were social norms, there were protocols, there were things that were important to whatever that context was, but they all still followed kind of a skeleton and a scaffolding that was outlined by Quarantelli and Dines as a general search and rescue protocol.
Lois, I think is how you'd say that.
That's how I would say that.
Lois, maybe 2001.
Lois.
Yeah. So Loist. I think it's Lois. Discuss the challenges with emotional regulation in volunteer search and rescue groups, specifically how members of SAR groups managed intense emotional responses from victims and family members. In some instances, victims and families did form these new sort of intense relationships out of the shared experience of going through the process, and they formed these with the rescuers, while others did not maintain the relationship going forward. So there's really not a guarantee either way, but sometimes that does happen because of the closeness one can feel with their benefactor.
And I imagine that's probably true for a lot of different professions where somebody, like, it's like trauma bonding. And we didn't talk about trauma bonding in this, but like that idea that like people kind of gain these important and impactful relationships as a result of some catastrophic event.
Right.
We could probably do a whole episode on trauma bonding and what that looks like. Now, Gardner et al. In 2019 evaluated various emotional regulation tactics of SAR workers, not volunteers, but workers, when confronted with missions. They identified 6 specific emotional regulation strategies employed by workers. They talked about rumination, suppression, avoidance, reappraisal, acceptance, and problem solving.
Wow.
I know, it's kind of cool. Now, out of the 102 rescue workers that they had that participated in the study, they found that rumination and suppression were linked to more stress-related symptoms. So they're kind of perseverating about that topic. They're ruminating about that topic, that situation. They're suppressing it. They're not talking about it. That was causing more stress. What they found was acceptance and avoidance were both linked to fewer symptoms. So they accepted that the situation was tough. They accepted the outcomes or the possible outcomes, or they avoided that altogether and worked in a different space. And both of those seemed to reduce stress overall, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Hare and colleagues in 2018 focused on a different population in their study. So they evaluated the traits of the SAR dogs, as we were talking about, and compared these to pet dogs, which is important, of course. And they found that SAR dogs were more likely trainable and higher energy, as well as less aggressive towards strangers and other dogs. So they were both sort of harder working, easy to train, less likely to get upset at novel things like people and animals. And I mean, they're going to be out dealing with people and animals that are strangers a lot. So I think that's a really important trait as well.
Yeah, my Boston Terrier would be a horrible SAR dog. She barks at anything that moves and she can't hear anymore. So,
yeah, indeed. Okay, so before we move on, let's go ahead and take one more quick ad obligation, and then we'll return talking about some famous search and rescue events.
So we are back from our sellout segment. And so what we are going to do is talk a little bit about some of the famous search and rescue events that are worth talking about that actually gained a lot of notoriety.
All right. So 9/11. All right.
Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Now, this was over 20 years ago now, but those of us who were around 20 years ago to remember this, which is a lot. On the 11th of September 2001, a major terrorist attack took place in New York, where 2 planes hit the World Trade Center. The attack and resulting collapse of the buildings resulted in 2,996 people, almost 3,000 people dying. Due to the scale and devastation of the event, SAR efforts were incredibly challenging. This is one of those urban SAR events that we were talking about. Only 11 people were rescued from the rubble of the towers. However, what's important to note about this particular SAR mission was the coordination between volunteers and first responders during the days after the event. There were major coordinated efforts to save the 11 lives that were rescued from the rubble, which is really important. And it's also tragic how many people they were unable to save from these sort of things. That's quite a disaster to try and come out of. So it's, lucky and happy they were able to save the ones that they were. Really unfortunate they were unable to save the ones that they couldn't.
Saving anybody in that situation was optimistic. That was an optimistic viewpoint, given the devastating nature of that event. The fact that they saved 11 people was pretty impressive. And so an interesting fact that people may or may not know, Steve Buscemi was part of the coordinated SAR efforts as one of the firefighters, a volunteer firefighter.
What?
Yeah, so he helped pull people out of the rubble.
That's wild.
So
I love Steve Buscemi.
Yeah, he was a firefighter. Yeah, Steve Buscemi's great. So another major search and rescue event that is talked about and widely known and even referenced in Jaws is the USS Indianapolis. So the USS Indianapolis was a United States naval cruiser that was active during World War II. And it was known for being very quick, a very speedy cruiser at the time. But the thing with the ship is that it sacrificed armor for speed. And that plays an important role in this. On its return trip from a mission to deliver parts for quote, Little Boy, which is the first ever nuclear weapon used in warfare, the ship was torpedoed and sunk on July 30th, 1945. SAR efforts were not coordinated until 4 days after the ship sank. Oof. They did not know the ship sank.
Yikes.
So that meant that 890 crew members were drifting in the ocean exposed to all kinds of things. Dehydration, shark attacks, and among many other things. There's some stories about how some of the crewmen would actually develop hallucinations and delusions and would believe and started to believe that there was like a bar underwater that they could swim to, that there were like pretty women and unlimited drinks and enough air and food and all that. Like they started doing really wild things.
Amazing where your priorities go when you're dying floating in the middle of the ocean.
I mean,
I just need a pretty woman right now, please.
I just need a pretty woman in a bar. And so what's crazy about this is that 316 of the crewmen out of the 890 survived. Ooh. The captain of the ship was dishonorably discharged, all kinds of stuff. It really wasn't his fault. There's a whole story about that. But the SAR mission was incredibly complex because in the 4 days that they were adrift, many of the lifeboats and the survivors started drifting miles and miles apart, up to 20 miles from each other at some points, so far away. So the only reason they were able to find anybody is because they were able to see oil slicks on the ocean.
Oh, geez.
Mm-hmm.
Whew, okay. In 1956, the ocean liner SS Andrea Doria collided with another ocean liner during a foggy afternoon trip. When the ship started sinking, passengers realized the lifeboats on the ship were destroyed due to the location of the boat. So assuming they were destroyed as part of the collision, what ended up happening is there was a coordinated effort to rescue the passengers. 5 other ships located near the collision redirected to help save the 1,663 crew and passengers. Unfortunately, still in this, 51 people perished from the collision and the subsequent disaster.
Well, and that's important to remember, is it was the collision that killed those folks. It was not the aftermath.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
It was the actual collision that ended up, unfortunately, taking the lives of those folks. But because of those coordinated efforts, the rest of the folks were saved.
That's good. I must have I misread that then. I apologize.
That was an issue on my end. I didn't write the notes clear enough, so that's my fault. Now, another success story that we talk about with SAR missions is Baby Jessica. So You were Baby Jessica? I was Baby Jessica. Surprise! No, so in October 1987, an 18-month-old baby fell into a well. The shaft was too small to lower adult SAR members into, and Baby Jessica was trapped there for 58 hours in a tiny well.
Thanks.
I know, that's a long time.
Poor thing.
The teams worked to extract her. What they did was they drilled a well adjacent to the well that Jessica was stuck in. So that goes back to that specialized equipment. And they bore a tunnel between the wells to get her out. So they had to drill across into the well to get her out of that. And she was safely extracted with minor injuries, excluding the loss of a toe. So she did lose a toe as a result of this due to gangrene. And she has grown up to live a happy, healthy life. So she's she's a little older than us, or she's about our age, actually. She's our age. Baby Jessica is our age.
Sounds like she was actually about the same age as I was. So.
Yeah. And she's happy and healthy and has kids and stuff. So actually, she might be like my age. She might be like, I'm like maybe 2 months older than her.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. There is a famous, I think it's Netflix documentary called 33. Is that what I'm thinking of?
I think that sounds right.
Something of that nature. It won a bunch of awards. I actually haven't seen it. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't seen it.
Okay. It's on my list of things to watch. But this is Chilean miners. There were 33 miners in Chile that were trapped underground for 60 8 days, over 2 months.
Whoa.
After a shaft that they were working on crumbled and trapped them in. They were stuck behind 770,000 tons of rock after the collapse. So that would definitely be sufficient to trap me somewhere for
that'll stop me for a while.
Yeah. Part of the SAR team included expertise from NASA on mitigating the psychological effects of being in an extreme environment. See our related astronaut episode, which I also did not think was going to come up in talking about search and rescue.
Yeah.
And so anyway, after extensive drilling, all of the miners were able to be saved, which is an awesome outcome. But man, that must have just been terrifying while they were down there.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, I imagine they must have committed to like, this is it for me. I'm done.
I imagine so. I mean, the fact that they were able to coordinate so many efforts, drill through, get them out, is really an impressive feat. And I think that's one thing that, as you know, I think about the notes that we put together for this. I think about that. Like, this is an impressive human feat to coordinate and rescue folks in these really dangerous situations. I mean, we said at the beginning when we talked about the stats, 93% of SAR missions are successful.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty incredible stat given the nature of the types of missions that are occurring.
Yeah. Again, unless you're in water.
Unless you're in water.
It's a little bit a lot.
Yeah, it's a little bit more dangerous. Now, my favorite little bit of information besides the Steve Buscemi bit is the idea of the bastard search. So there is this one type of search that's employed by land field search teams, and it's called bastard search, and it gets its name from the result of the actual search. So essentially what happens is the team who would look in common places, it's going to start with the team itself, the coordinating team, will look in common places for the lost person. Because typically that person has been lost and they're just at a friend's house playing video games, they're hanging out at a bar or something. And these coordinated searches start with the common places first before they go into some of the more dangerous terrain, because the name comes from team members. That's what they would call the lost person once they found them in a safe place.
Got it.
They'd be like, oh, you were at your friend's house, you're such a bastard. Like, that's what would happen. And so that's why it's called a bastard search. And the bastard searches are employed as like a prerequisite. Like, hey, let's go ahead and check all the common places we know they would be before we go and coordinate major search efforts, just in case.
So the story about the trampers, they maybe would have been called bastards or bastard search.
Yeah, exactly. Because you know they were on their path, they weren't lost, and yeah, that's exactly it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have to say about search and rescue. I think some quick take homes here. One is just that if you want to join this kind of effort, I think that is amazing. That is a wonderfully charitable, honorable thing to do. And if you want to do that, go get the training necessary to ensure that you can do it well and provide a lot of actually meaningful support. Otherwise, I think if you are wanting to be involved in this, but you're unwilling to go through training, consider instead just making some kind of donation or supporting an event or charity or something that does involve these coordinations, because a poorly trained contribution or attempts to contribute could result in making things actually worse.
Yeah.
Or missing someone entirely, where it's like you were responsible for an area you didn't know how to adequately look, and then that person who would have been found by someone who had better training, it goes unfound.
Yeah.
And so that would be my main take home point here is like, if you want to do this, that's awesome. Go through the systems to do it. Otherwise, maybe just support it in another way.
Yeah, and I think my big take home point is exactly that. Is like if you are wanting to do this and you're willing to put in the effort and the time, get some training on it. You know, most of the time these events, these missions, I should say, are successful, but they're successful because of the highly trained and specialized folks that work in those spaces. When they do employ volunteers, those volunteers are also people who know their limits. So they are engaged with teams and they're coordinating with teams that only have them engage in activities that are within that volunteer's scope of practice and limit. So if you want to take part, know what your limit is. Know what you can and can't do. Be realistic about that, because if you are lying about that stuff, then you're going to prevent that search and rescue mission from actually being successful.
Right.
And if you really want to do this and you want to do this long term, go get the training to do it to keep everybody safe. Because it's not just the person who's the victim that is who you're trying to help. You're also responsible for the safety of the people around you.
Yeah.
And that is a really important aspect of this too.
Definitely don't want to lose people on the SAR team when you're on a rescue effort of sorts.
Right, exactly.
And don't be a bastard.
Don't be a bastard. Check in with your mom. Make sure she's
General
okay.
life advice.
Make sure she knows where you're at.
Yep. Leave
your bike out in front of your friend's house when you go over there, that kind of thing. You know, the indicators that we had when we were kids.
All right. Anything else on search and rescue?
Nope. More power to y'all.
Perfect.
That's a tough job.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, everyone who does that sort of work. That's amazing, and hopefully there are others out there who may be inspired in hearing this that they want to get the training to do that kind of work as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's transition to some recommendations.
Recommendations.
My recommendation is a record that came out in 2021, and it is something that I don't typically listen to, but it was something that I had a lot of fun with listening to when I discovered it. As a former hardcore kid that really was like a punk kid that found a hardcore scene and hated all the hardcore that was in it because a lot of times there was a lot of pretension and like everybody took themselves too seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I've recently revisited some like newer hardcore, and this is a hardcore band called Section Hate.
Okay.
Just to be clear, it is stylized, not spelled hate, H-A-T-E. It's stylized as H8.
Yeah, the number 8.
The number 8. They have a new album called Welcome to the Nightmare, and it is horrible artwork. It is just not good. It's basically like robots, and it's really over the top. This band is from LA. They're a hardcore band. The singer was this guy named Mexi Mike, who was in a band called Furious Styles, I believe.
Okay.
And it is a lot of fun if you like hardcore. It's like metallic hardcore, so it's got some cool like metal riffs in it. And there's some really ridiculous lines. There's a line where they just shout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Section Hate. It's very silly and it's very over the top, but it's also like a lot of fun to listen to. So if you like hardcore, you like hardcore bands and like straight up traditional kind of hardcore, metallic hardcore, like bands like All Out War, stuff like that, go listen to it. You'll have fun.
All right. That's sounds somewhat intriguing.
Yeah, it's fun.
All right, I'm going to recommend a board game for those listeners who are also gamers. This is a game that's been around for at least a few years, but I just picked it up. It's called Everdell. This has a combination of different strategies. You got a little bit of engine building, worker placement. It's really cute, super family-friendly game. Essentially, in it, you are placing little critters inside of this forest. It has actually part of it is you build this cardboard tree, and you have your workers on the tree and like little events on the tree. And what you're going to do is you're collecting cards to build like what's referred to as your city. And the cards can work together. And that's part of the engine building component. That's really cool. And so you're just going to, it doesn't take terribly long. The game probably is going to be like an hour and a half-ish maybe. And the artwork is really cute. The theme is very cute. It's all very, the artwork is beautiful. The whole thing is very cute, but it's, I really like, it's relatively straightforward. Once you get the hang of the overall structure of the rules, it's not very complicated at all. And you just kind of go through and build your cute little critter city. And
I love that.
So far I'm enjoying it. So that's my recommendation.
That's so great. That's so wholesome.
Indeed. All right. If you have any more to say to us about search and rescue, you'd like to share a story or tell us some horror stories, maybe not the horror stories part, share some advice or some recommendations, or tell us how you got started in it, or tell us about a board game or a new really weird album with terrible artwork that you are into right now, you should definitely reach out to us. You can email us directly at info@wwdpodcast.com or reach out to us on all the social media platforms where we are very eager to hear from each and every one of you. If you'd like to ask us even just basic questions, we're happy to hear those. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. We are now publishing all of these episodes as audio-only episodes to YouTube if you'd like to consume them that way. Also, if you join us on Patreon, then we'll post our videos to YouTube. That is behind-the-scenes content there as well.
Yeah.
Speaking of Patreon, I would like to thank the following people for their amazing contribution to keeping us going. That is Amanda, Kathleen, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. Thank you to my amazing team, Justin, Amber, Selena, Kyle, Alan, Britt, and Shane for putting together the notes for today's episode.
Thank you for letting me. It was fun.
And I will let you help in this episode. But I think that is all I have for that. So before we go, anything else from you, Shane?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.